Welcome back to the table. Today, Ryan and I are going to give you a look at a new game from Capstone. This one is called Fire and Stone, Siege of Vienna, 1683. That is a mouthful, and as you could maybe guess, it is a war game, but this is kind of a streamlined war game experience for sure. A little bit more accessible, but certainly not a gateway game.
Yeah, and it kind of follows in the vein of like Watergate when you have a two-player asymmetric game where each player has asymmetric goals. Now, of course, the theme is also historical. Like Watergate, this is based on an actual event that happened, the Siege of Vienna, which was a real thing that pit these two factions against each other. But I would say that's where the comparisons to Watergate end. Although if you do like asymmetric two-player games, this one does have a lot to offer by giving each player control of one of the sides of this conflict.
Yeah, you've got the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburgs. And these two sides, this is basically a very micro siege. This is not a big, massive war game. This is really takes place over a short period of time. And in fact, I didn't know much about it until I read this. This comes with the game. This is basically a historical and designer notes booklet that has a lot of really good information. Now, if you're into this sort of thing, you'll love it.
Yeah.
But even if you're not into this sort of thing, which I am typically not, I actually found myself reading this, finding all sorts of things out about the period of time, but also about the game, because the cool thing is there's actually references to a lot of the components, specifically the cards. The cards that we're going to be playing in the game have very historical moments on them, and they're referenced in this book, which made it very cool. So it's not just flavor text that you see for the sake of flavor text on these cards. It really has a lot of relevance to this. So it gives you a little bit of an opportunity to get that much deeper into the theme of the game.
Yeah, and of course, like any one of these historical war games, the actual outcome is completely up to you. You're going to be changing the course of history here as you play. But this is kind of the setup as it happened in the siege. The Habsburgs were behind this wall protecting the city. And you'll see that they're playing more of a defensive game here with these fortifications and these cannons and all of these control markers, whereas the Ottomans start with almost nothing, and they have to try to force their way forward and siege this city. And that's how you end up with these very asymmetric end goals as well.
Yeah, like Ryan said, the asymmetry here is defense and offense. And both players really have to take that to heart, because if the Habsburgs start playing offense right away, they're going to find out very quickly that it may not be the best idea, because two big differences in the components between the two sides are your troops decks. Now let's talk a little bit about all the components you'll see here, but I will start with these troops decks. These are going to be involved, of course, in all of the battles. And I wanted to bring these up because one of the things that the designer really tried to do here is, with all the war games that he had played throughout the years, he'd seen sort of maybe a little negligence on the part of the human cost of war. You know, if you've played a lot of war games, that's really not focused on. In this one, it is definitely a human cost going on here, this war of attrition, and you see that when you're putting these troops forward, because the battles are more about lost troops, in my opinion, than they are sort of the progress I'm making across the board.
Yeah, really quick, let's just kind of talk about those in-game conditions, because one of them is losing all of your troops. If you lose all of your troops, you lose the game. And the Habsburgs have a very small troop deck compared to the Ottomans, and that's one of the key differences. You really need to play defense. You can't really risk these troops. In addition to that, we both have morale tracks. If your morale track ever gets to the end, you lose as well, giving the opponent victory. Now, those are shared goals.
Yes.
However, the way that you're going to be influencing morale and the way that you're going to be going through your troop deck, of course, is different. Because, of course, you have to measure these troop sizes. Plus, the Ottomans have more ways to chip down the Habsburgs' morale than the Habsburgs can do to the Ottomans.
Yeah, like Ryan said, there is asymmetry in these troop decks. I have 20 troops in my deck. Ryan in the Habsburgs only has 12, so that's a big difference. But the asymmetry really comes through in those win-loss objectives, because in addition to those shared ones, we have a couple that allow us to win too. Ryan just has to survive the game. The Habsburgs really want to just be around at the end of 5 rounds. If the game goes to the end of 5 rounds, the Habsburgs win. The Ottoman Empire obviously hasn't won by that point. Now, on the flip side, the Ottoman Empire has a little bit more offensive objectives that they can do to win. They can take control of the curtain wall, which, as you can see, is all the way across the board. Or, interestingly enough, they can take control of these two locations here. This is the Ravelin and the Berg Bastion. And I know these names because they are listed in the rule book as well. This entire map is given a lot of theme based on the actual geography of this siege.
And these troop placements, the way you actually start this board set up, it's going to tell you what's going to go in each one of these areas. The Habsburgs have a ton of these cannons and these structural fortifications, which are going to prevent the advance of the Ottomans. The Ottomans do not start entrenched like this. They start with just a few cannons out here in their camp that they're slowly going to have to march. So not only are the goals asymmetric, but actually the way you're playing and the strategies you're using are incredibly different, because I, as the Habsburgs, just want to kind of wait and see what happens, wait and see what the Ottomans do as I'm shooting them with all these cannons, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. He has a lot of cannons. Not only does he have a lot and more than the Ottomans, but all of his cannons are going to be firing, whereas when I'm taking my actions, I'm firing based on my cannon's position. So there's asymmetry all throughout this game.
And it's very thematic. I mean, that captures that feeling of the Ottomans having to kind of run up as they're being under that cannon fire, which is actually what happened in the actual events.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what you're doing on the game. We're not going to give you a complete how to play, but we do want to talk about how the game is played. There is a strategy deck. This is going to be the cards that you use every round. Each player is going to have 5 of these in their hand, and they do a number of different things. All of these represent different events or potentially responses to events in the other deck, but they can also be used, effectively burnt or discarded, to do one of a number of general actions that you can take too. So every turn you take, you're looking at your cards and thinking, oh, is this a good opportunity to do this specific thing? Or would I rather just do a general assault and discard that card to do that? Now, in addition to these strategy cards, you're also going to have these tactics cards. Now, we're going to get to battle in a second, but tactics cards come into play with those troops. When we're doing battle via an assault by me or a sortie from him, we're going to put troops out and a tactics card next to those troops, potentially. But you're only going to get 5 of them.
Yeah, and these 5 are going to have to last you the entire game. And granted, there are 5 rounds in the game. You could play 1 per round, but I guarantee there's going to be more than 1 battle per round.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to pick and choose when to use these. Now, this is another aspect of the game where there is a lot of asymmetry. Our strategy decks have a lot of cards in common. They do kind of some of the same special events for both of us, and there is some differences there, but these tactics cards are vastly different
Yeah,
from
they're
each
quite
other.
different. There are some similarities, but even the ones that are similar are still different.
And that makes sense thematically, like the Ottomans trying to push through that city wall. You have a lot of tactics cards that represent that, while my cards can have a little bit more of a defensive bent to them. And it just depends on what you draw. These 5 cards that you draw are going to kind of determine the strategies that you might use in the game. You might want to start a fight at particular moments, particularly based on what you have in your hand.
Right. If a big fight comes up that you definitely want to win, you need to win this fight, there's going to be the right mix of potentially one of your tactics cards and a troop setup that you're like, okay, I'm only going to do this once because my troops come at a cost. These tactics cards are going to be gone once I use them. So you really need to be careful how you do that. And these strategy cards, like I said, when you use the event, these are going to be very sort of context sensitive to what's happening at the moment. But we do want to talk a little bit about the general actions that you take as well with these cards, just by simply discarding it on your turn. And these are a variety of things in terms of, there's no movement in the game per se.
Not really. There's no basic move,
but
right?
There's a few different abilities on each side where they can make progress forward for the Ottomans, but basically hold their ground for the Habsburgs.
Yeah, and I do want to reiterate something David said, because these cards have very, very powerful events. And you'll actually see that a lot of them have really cool names, thematic names, and a bit of history at the bottom, which is really neat. It tells you how this event actually happened, but these are very good. And what you're maybe not thinking when you first start to play the game is, as soon as you discard one of these strategy cards to take a basic action, it's gone.
Right.
And there's no duplicates. These are all unique cards. So if you have a card in your hand that has a very, very powerful event, be careful not to use it to do an action. But sometimes you're going to have to, because you can't do any actions without discarding cards. And a little bit later, you might have realized you made the wrong decision. You discarded a card that would have been very handy later. And I think that that's a point of tension, a really strong decision that you have to make with these multi-use cards. And, we both like multi-use cards.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And you'll find yourself often sweating over, like, these response cards especially.
Yes.
Because I'm trying to guess what is David going to do? This card cancels his action. This card cancels an event. What is he going to, what is he going to do on his turn? And so you're trying to almost guess what you think the opponent might be doing.
Yes.
And so you have that like cat and mouse situation happening as well.
For sure, there are mind games at work here. Not only when you're playing the strategy cards, but also when you're in those battles and you're playing your troops face down, you're playing your tactics cards face down, and then there's a reveal moment where you're showing how many you're committing there. The battles don't even have to be contested. I might go in with an assault, and Ryan might say, I'm not going to contest it.
Right.
Now, on the flip side of that, sometimes that can be great for the Habsburgs because they still get to fire their cannons at times when I wouldn't expect it. In fact, some of my abilities, when I entrench, for example, I'm basically taking presence in one of these three hexes right here. When I do that, that's great for me. I'm progressing forward. I'm controlling more territory so that I can actually assault some of these other hexes. But every time I entrench, he gets to basically fire off all of his cannons on the board, which could possibly do quite a bit of damage to my troops.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point too, in that our basic actions, there's a little bit of overlap there, but there are vastly different. For example, David does have that entrench action that lets him move. The Habsburgs have no move action. These cannons are where they are. You can't be wheeling them around. They're in place. And so while David can constantly be moving, I can't. The flip side, like we talked about, is I can have an action to barrage where I can just fire with all of my cannons anyway because they are already in place. They're entrenched. They have, we have the better technology in this situation. So that action to barrage is one that I have that David doesn't have access to.
And that's where those dice come in. You've seen these dice maybe here in the top-down camera. This isn't a game where the battles are just simply controlled by a roll of the dice, but the dice will come in as it relates to the casualties in the troops that you're going to get. Whenever cannons fire, you're going to roll dice equal to, in my case, equal to the number of cannons that I have adjacent to the hex where we're engaged. For the Habsburgs, it's all of his cannons.
All the time.
All of his cannons are up on walls. They all have a good shot at everything. So he's rolling a lot of dice. So the more I can get rid of his cannons, the fewer casualties I might have, and vice versa.
Yeah, and that's a key part of the game too, is trying to figure out when is the right time to rush, right? Because like David said, there's no real movement in this game. Once you get to a certain point, and for example, say the Ottomans start moving forward, once they get to a certain point, the only way to move forward is to fight. And that is an action that we share. But before I talk about fighting, I want to talk about one other action that we share.
Yeah.
And that's tunneling or mining. And this is, again, something historic that happened. They would actually dig underneath the enemy and set explosives underground to blow up some of these fortifications. And there are two types of fortifications. You'll see these structural ones, and then there's improvised fortifications that we can build out over the course of the game. But you can just mine under them and blow them up.
Yeah, both sides are going to be able to put at least improvised fortifications. In his case, he's going to have some structural fortifications. But getting rid of those has a significant impact on your chances during battle. When you take the mine action, though, you're simply going to reach in here after discarding a card to do so, pull out one of these tokens that has a number on a value on it. It's a 1, 2, maybe a 3, and you place it down here. This is another one of those mind game situations because you're placing these face down. The other player's sitting there looking at that going, how close are you to 4? And why do I say 4? Is because once you know that you have a total value of at least 4 on those tokens, you can, after a mine action, flip them over and do exactly what Ryan said. Blow up an adjacent hex to where you have control, taking out some things on there. Structural fortifications, just really doing some damage so it makes it easier to progress in there.
Yeah, because these fortifications are really going to help in battle. And that's one action that we share. Although, again, like I said earlier, the Habsburgs maybe don't want to take that action so much because you're depleting your already limited troop supply, whereas the Ottomans are going to be assaulting, which is their attack action, probably assaulting quite a bit. And I think that's kind of the meat of the game. As you get into these engagements, that's when you have to start making those really tough decisions when it comes to your troops and your tactics cards.
Yeah, and making those decisions about the troops, it works like this. Whenever we get into one of the battles when someone's assaulting or performing a sortie, you're going to, after you decide whether or not it's going to be contested, if it is going to be contested, you go to the battle. And these troops decks aren't decks of cards that you're going to be drawing off the top of. You're going to be able to pick the whole thing, look up, take whatever troops you want up to a certain number. Usually that's 3. Now, with the Ottoman Empire, it can be a little bit more based on a few things, but with the Habsburgs, it's typically
max 3,
or limited to whatever I happen to play. So you're going to put those in a front line, as it were, face down, as is your opponent. Then the attacker is going to take one of those 5 tactics cards, if they want, and add that to their front line. Then the defender is going to do the same. So you may or may not have tactics cards there. At that point, all the cards are revealed, so you see the values of the troops in the front line, as well as the tactics card, which can have an impact right then or there, or maybe an ongoing impact for the battle, or something that happens during the casualties phase. And then once that happens, you're going to go through step by step this very structured sort of flow chart, if you will, of how to go through a battle.
And that's included on this player aid, and I think that this is a very great addition. For one thing, it does show all the actions.
And it looks a little overwhelming.
It does. It can look a little overwhelming.
But it really isn't.
But it's a step by step. It literally takes you through a battle step by step. It just asks you a question. Did this happen? If so, then this happens.
Yeah.
And you just go through all the way to the bottom, and it literally tells you every step of the way. I can say that David and I played this, a few times, but even on our first play, we didn't have any problems because we were able to just follow this list in every combat.
Yeah, and remember, the battle's not, for the Ottomans, it is usually about wanting to try to make progress and move forward and get some objectives taken care of. For the Habsburgs, though, it really is more about that loss of troops. You don't want to lose your troops. You also want to start chipping away at my troops. So there's definitely layers to the battles in this thing, but I can't stress enough how much as you play, you really start to feel, oh, this is less about territories, at least for the Habsburgs, as it is managing my troops and managing the loss of life.
Yeah, and David touched on a key thing there when he said that you can choose not to contest a fight. If the Ottomans come in, the Habsburgs can just say, take the hex. I'm not going to defend it with my troops. Because this is such a limited supply. And I, as the Habsburgs, I get to shoot my cannons either way.
I know.
Whether I contest or not. So there are moments when it's actually like, take the hex. You're going to come under a lot of cannon fire, but I'm not putting any troops at risk. Now, early on, you're like, yeah, I'm contesting everything. I've got 12 troops. But then after a couple fights, you might lose 4 troops and you realize I only have 8 left for the rest of the game. Now, I can't contest like I used to be able to. And the Ottomans need to put the Habsburgs in that position.
Yeah.
So playing these, I actually think maybe the Habsburgs is a little easier to start with because all you're doing is holding out. You're just having to hope that the Ottomans don't push too hard, that you can beat them in a few key spaces, but you don't have to really be the one that's pressing the attack. In fact, you're benefiting if the Ottomans are taking kind of slow playing it a little bit.
For sure. And as the Ottomans, you don't want to generally be slow playing it. You really want to get up there as quickly as possible, entrench in these 3 locations, and then assault.
Yeah.
Not only to move across the map to take those territories that you need to take, but also really just to whittle down their troops as much as possible, because if they're not paying attention, they might run out of troops. And once you start changing those variables for the other player, that's when they really have to start thinking, okay, wait a minute. I was doing this. I was contesting, but now I need to not contest. Or early on, you might not contest at all, but then you might find that I've spread a little too far and a little too close. And you're like, well, now I have to contest every single time because he's about to win the game.
Yeah, once the Habsburgs lose these cannons here, it becomes a very different game. It becomes a lot harder to make that decision.
Exactly, because your barrage goes down to rolling 4 dice potentially instead of 8.
And another thing to mention, too, that we didn't really talk about is that after a battle, if troops are eliminated, they're, of course, eliminated from the entire game. But even if they weren't eliminated, they were committed to that fight, they go into a discard pile. And if you start another fight that same round, you only have access to the troops left in your actual deck or hand. So the Ottomans can trigger way more combats per round than the Habsburgs can possibly defend because all your troops are going to be sitting in the discard pile. Now, you can pull them back out, but you have to pay morale.
Yeah.
And again, the Ottomans are going to be chipping at that Habsburg morale the entire game, so you need to be very careful about spending morale.
Yeah, I do think that Habsburg morale is probably a little bit more at risk than the Ottomans because once you get low on troops, that decision to pull them out of your discard pile can be interesting. And I think that's also a very interesting mechanic too, because we didn't mention this, but after the battle and after you add up all the values to see who won, the ones that weren't eliminated from the casualties go into that discard pile. At the beginning of the round, they're just going to come back into the deck. So you are able to recycle a lot of troops, but you're also able to lose up to 2 troops every battle, potentially.
Well, yeah, potentially. I mean, from cannon fire, cannons can only take out 2 troops. I guess that's worth mentioning because you look at this board and you think, oh, they're firing 8 cannons. They're just going to burn through that deck. every barrage can only kill one and every battle can only kill two. But you can still lose other troops to, say, for example, tactics cards. And there might even be some strategy cards that target your troop deck as well, taking cards out of that troop deck. And so you never really know exactly how safe you are, even when you think that you're starting a combat. And the fact that the Ottomans can bring so many troops in, they can bring up to 6 troops into a battle in the right situation, where the Habsburgs can only bring 3. And that feels like overwhelming odds. But between the cannons, between the fortifications, between the tactics cards, the Habsburgs have to kind of even that out a little bit.
Yeah, those odds can feel overwhelming, but at the same time, some of these strategy cards, like Ryan said, some of the tactics cards, you're looking at one, you're just knowing, oh, if I can lure the other player into this situation where they have this false sense of security, I could be coming in with 6 troops, and he has a card that effectively just eliminates one of my plans and really takes the wind out of my sails. It could be a significant shift in the tides of war.
Yeah, and I do want to say one more thing. Again, comparing this to that other capstone game, Watergate, which is a big favorite of mine, this game favors multiple plays. If you play this game a lot, especially against the same opponent, you'll start to learn. You know what's in their deck. You know what's coming. You see that look in their face, and you're like, wait a minute, I think I might know what you have. Or I've seen you pull off the same strategy before. Are you going to do it the same way this time? And you kind of get these emerging organic moments that come from repeated plays.
Yeah, I would almost suggest you learn the game, which is very simple to play mechanically, and then just play it without thinking too much once. And then, after you've done that, that is really a good learning exercise, as is looking through this book. I mean, the whole thing feels like a bit of a learning exercise when you play that first game, because that second game you're going to go, okay, now I know what I have in my deck. More importantly, now I know what you have in your deck.
Yeah, and is this when you're going on Wikipedia saying, like, what was the Ottoman strategy again? Let me see if I can copy what they were doing.
I gotta say, and I'm not trying to push this too much, but this is really compelling to me.
It's neat.
It has some really interesting things. It's well written, and it's a nice addition to a game like this, which historical games are usually not my bag. But when you have something like this that's easy to digest, you're like, okay, this is kind of cool how they're weaving this into the mechanics. So I found that really, really interesting.
Yeah.
But this is Fire and Stone, Siege of Vienna, 1683. If you have any questions at all, please make them in the comments below. We'll do our best to answer what we can. Until next time, though, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then. Congratulations, you got to the end of one of our videos. Now, if you want more practice, just click on the video over here. It's another video. You might not have seen it yet, so click on it. If you don't want to do that, at least click on the subscription button below. That always helps us. And if you want notifications, please ring that bell.